welcome to the 2-minute warning interview series, where we're going to take a dive into what is happening already and what should be happening in the energy transition in the Middle East and beyond. My name is 𝗥𝗵𝗲𝗁. I'm the director of the Energy Transition Dialogues of Gulf Intelligence, and I'm very glad to have Greg Ross with us today. He is head of sustainability at Petrofac, and from the brief conversation we've had before signing on, there is going to be a lot to say. Greg, thank you very much for joining us.
Real pleasure.
Let's dive in because we're short on time. Like I say, there are a lot of areas that we'd like to cover. So Petrofac is working across the board, got offshore wind, CCUS, hydrogen, waste evaluation, reduction, and I'm sure other areas as well that I haven't mentioned. And as a company, you're committed to net zero in scope 1 and 2 emissions by 2030. So against that backdrop, what are your thoughts when it comes to steps that industry and government need to take to make these goals by 2030 viable? Of course, it's a holistic effort. There are silos, islands will think. What are your thoughts? What's needed?
Well, let me first start. Let me just say what we've done, and then I'll broaden out to on industry. I mean, we made a net zero commitment last year in August, and really much of our work has been spent since then really developing a credible strategy that's going to deliver that. And it's around sort of 3 pillars: enable, reduce, and transform. So it's enabling our staff to be net zero advocates, supporting our clients and our value chain in their lower carbon ambitions, and the reduce piece is around really reducing our emissions and driving in energy efficiencies into what we do, and then transform is really about the whole digital piece, about how we embrace new technology and really adopt new ways of working. And we're going to do this through sort of 5 levers: switching to renewable energy where we can off the grid, solar, diesel, hybrid at our sites where the geographies permit, really optimizing our operations and driving in energy efficiencies, reducing emissions, looking at things like flaring, venting emissions, really action on methane and carbon abatement, and then looking probably a little bit further out how we electrify our transportation. We've got some success there in the UK, building in EV points for our staff, looking at what we can do for our clients across our geographies. And then I guess the big piece is really around scope 3. How do we really start to address embodied carbon at the front end in our supply chain, the steel, the cement we use in our projects, right through to how do we differentiate ourselves and produce a low carbon service offering.
When would you hope to start making progress on scope 3? When would you hope?
Well, we are at the moment. I mean, in fact, I just set up a collaboration call with some of my colleagues within the EPC industry, really to look at how we can collaborate across this space. And so we're using a standard industry tool, and I guess a shout out to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. We've got a tool called Qantas. Great tool if you're really trying to grapple around scope 3. Reach out to them and use it. It's a great way to get a high level scope 3 inventory, and then from there, identify really where are the hotspots in our carbon, and then start to engage our supply chain around low carbon really initiatives and opportunities they're doing, whether it's steel providers that have got electric arc furnaces, or there's the first steel manufacturers in, I think, Sweden, who have got a high driven steel manufacturing process, through to what's happening in cement and some of the other more carbon intensive materials that we use. But it's I
mean, that's a great template for others in the oil and gas industry, because scope 3 is intimidating the vast majority of operators, and many are trying to right now. Scope 1 and scope 2 are simply enough of a challenge without trying to add scope 3 into the mix as well. Is that what you're seeing as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, look, to have credibility in scope 3, you have to get your house in order. So we have a focus on scope 1 and 2, and really looking to see how we can transform to a lower carbon business. And I would say we're making real progress. I mean, it's a journey. I mean, the adage it's a marathon, not a sprint is absolutely, I try not to use too many cliches, but it's absolutely true.
We're very pro cliches here.
but certainly we can't do this sequentially. We have to do everything in parallel. So we're really doing all we can to look at our scope 3, and in fact looking more in terms of the service offering that we've set up to really enable our clients, our new energies service offerings, really looking at, what can we do in things like hydrogen, direct CCUS, broaden our presence in wind to really support our clients in that endeavor as well.
I mean, also, I just want to talk about how partnerships and alliances, you touched there on how you're doing some on a standalone basis, and obviously companies as well. So in the month of September alone, Petrofac signed deals relating to carbon capture and hydrogen. So again, this is very common with energy companies, fossil fuel companies. There's a real push for the P word, partnerships, really. And looking at the fossil fuel industry, what's your take on M&A over the next year as companies push their decarbonisation efforts? Do you see a big M&A push coming?
Oh, difficult question. I really need to put in my
multifaceted one, certainly.
Strategy colleague John Carpenter for this, but
the reason I ask is because we're seeing tier 1 companies pushing some of their less clean assets sometimes onto tier 2 and tier 3 and so on, as they have those deeper pockets to be able to establish their own renewable arms or their own renewable divisions. And that's not a necessarily criticism, but critics do say that, hang on, it's actually pushing the problem along as within this M&A environment rather than addressing it. So the tier 1s that are in a far brighter spotlight and a lot more criticism, of course, as we saw with Shell earlier this year at The Hague, they're seemingly fast cleaning up their act, where you have tier 2 and tier 3 fossil fuel companies who are facing a little bit more of an uphill struggle. So I was just wondering if that's something you've been seeing.
Well, I would go as far as to say the only way we're going to nail this net zero challenge and really decarbonize, can get the deep decarbonisation need across all our energy systems is through collaboration and through partnership. I mean, we have to look for win-wins and common areas we're technology agnostic, so we reach out to various partners. So and so we've got a number of partnerships set up, whether it's the 𝗥𝗵𝗲𝗁 project. This is a new green hydrogen project we're progressing in Australia. We're doing some innovative work on the Acorn CCUS cluster in the UK, and also one of the largest wind farm offshore developments, Seagreen. So these areas that we're working in, and I think yes, it's where we can where it's the work I'm doing with our peer companies, collaborating around scope 3 on a sort of an inter-company level on that smaller piece of work, or whether it's looking more larger in terms of how we can scale up those enabling technologies, then yeah, I think we have to look at how we can work together and how we can form these alliances to get around this fundamental challenge.
Absolutely. I mean, at the moment, we're seeing this clear gap between investments needed for net zero and the reality of current financing. So BNEF's latest Energy Outlook report, the costs of reaching net zero globally by 2050 are up to $173 trillion over the next 30 years. Now, of course, that sounds like an intimidating figure, but it's a global figure, and B, it's going to be a hell of a lot cheaper than the cost of not doing anything and social cost, most notably. Against those, that sort of demand for capital and the gap between net zero investments today and what's needed. What do you think role do you think IOCs can play to accelerate development, especially financial support?
Okay. Well, I think in a lot of the carbon debate, I think the crux of the problem is, and we touched on this prior to coming on the call, is the significant gap between rhetoric and reality. So, and even if it's well-intentioned commitments, there is this gaping chasm. I mean, let's just look at CCUS. In preparation for this webinar, I was reading a JP Morgan do this annual energy report, and there's one statistic that jumped out, which is the I think the number of scientific articles on CCUS versus the number of implemented projects, the highest ratio ever in any field, and so it gives you a sense that we're doing a lot of talking, and if you look at the 𝗥𝗵𝗲𝗀𝗃 program, again, lots, it's replete with hydrogen, CCUS, transition, and sustainable development goals. But I think we need to move this ambition into action. And I don't know whether it's we've underestimated some of the social or structural changes that are required for decarbonisation, or we're just over optimistic. But certainly one of the key things I think it would enable this is an internal, or certainly setting a realistic cost for carbon. A carbon price that really drives that investment, because at the moment there are a number of technologies that simply won't get off the ground until we have a realistic cost for carbon that will drive that investment and drive the move from projects which at the moment are just sort of government, industry, subsidized partnerships to something which is an investable project which the private sector can see a return in and then can scale up, and then we'll get that penetration we need. And look, just
to your earlier point, it's just human nature that it's a lot easier to talk than to act. But just on that carbon pricing element, do you expect, you've got Europe with the 𝗥𝗵𝗲𝗃 more recently, do you expect further big progress to be made at COP?
It'll be interesting to see. I think the G20 last year, they spoke about the Saudi champions spoke about the carbon circular carbon cycle. This year it was a lot about carbon tax, and look, to me, let's see what commitments come out of COP, and I mean, it's an exciting time. I mean, we will certainly be rising to the challenge of anything that comes out of that. And look, speaking personally about Petrofac's net zero commitment, I'm extremely proud of really where we're going, the support I get from Sami Iskander, our CEO, and really the whole of the board. There's a clear commitment to transition and transform the business, and I think the industry gets it. I think what we need to do now is transfer this ambition into action.
How much of it is a case, because it's not the first time industry clarity on carbon pricing, and it's this is not a one-off. It's been a common comment from leading members of the the fossil fuel industry for years and years. Do you think that, not necessarily tier ones, but do you think that other entities within the fossil fuel market are waiting for that price transparency before they take significant moves into digitalization or significant moves into CCUS and other technologies? Do you think that that is essentially the key that's needed to turn the lock and to open the door? So we like our cliches as well.
Yeah, look, I don't know. I think, look, like any major change, there is that sort of evolution. You have these early adopters and the innovators, and but we on some of these technologies we've passed that tipping point, and we're seeing that, and certainly on wind and on solar, we're there and we're seeing significant penetration. I think the challenge is, and it's getting back to this sort of two world syndrome. Is you've got an OECD industrialized world that have their economies on fossil fuels, and they're now asking a non-industrialized developing world who have a carbon footprint of probably a fifth or a tenth of them to form this guiding coalition and wean themselves off fossil fuels and usher in this new era of net zero. And look, I'm the most passionate advocate of transitioning to a low carbon economy. I just asked my wife; she's sick and tired of hearing about it. But really, we need to appreciate it's a big ask when your economies are struggling to get out of a pandemic-induced recession, and there are big structural impediments. You're wedded to fossil fuels. How do you square that circle? And just look how we've responded to the pandemic. You know, a systemic global issue that has been in our face, immediate, and still we have these gross disparities across the world.
And
we
continue to.
Coordination for what should be a global issue.
Absolutely.
You know, and now we're so while I'm an optimist at heart, I reserve some of that for really achieving net zero by 2050, because I think we've got some real structural challenges about how we're going to bring everyone on board when we still have an issue that's very polarized in terms of political thinking, and a world that is still not operating globally enough in terms of holistically looking at climate change, looking at the social, political, and structural things that need to change. And we still don't have enough people in the tent really pushing that forward collectively to, I think, you know, 2050 is going to be a challenge. I hope, but it's going to be a challenge. So let's see what comes out.
Indeed. And I think that, you know, it's not just the decarbonisation factor with the have and the have-nots, it's also the digitalisation factor which feeds into decarbonisation. And it's also on a short-term, you've touched on it already, on a short-term basis, it's the impact of the pandemic and the level of recovery. Most nations aren't lucky enough, privileged enough to have multi-million-pound recovery packages, and many are going to be carrying the weight, the burden of the post-COVID-19 world for many years, if not a few decades.
Sorry, but just on that, I mean, if you look at the delays with the climate financing, the $100 billion was promised from each year at Paris. That hasn't been forthcoming, and so
that was that was supposed to be from last year, wasn't it?
Yeah, so there should have been these, you know, the enabling mechanisms to drive this transition are still being put in place. So I think they, you know, and that will be key. You know, the transition will follow the money, and we've seen that with how the sort of capital allocation decisions of our investors have driven the transition. They're uncomfortable with climate risk, and they want greater transparency of that within companies' disclosures. So and on that, we've been doing a big piece of work around ensuring that we're compliant with the Task Force and climate-related disclosures, and really having those discussions across the organization about how we dealing with both managing climate risk as well as pivoting the organization to take advantage of climate opportunities and the changes coming in this energy transition.
I'm glad you just mentioned transparency there, because we're heading towards the end. I just want to wrap up on a point where it comes to ESG data, and of course this feeds in as well to what we were discussing now about those disparities. And an ideal world, if we had the world's biggest companies, including fossil fuel companies and their deep pockets, and everybody was committing to a certain degree, and it was in a cohesive, transparent manner when it comes to ESG, and the data was being managed correctly and so on, then that 100 billion should not necessarily be achieved by that alone, but certainly should account for a significant chunk, and like you say, here in the red. So ESG assets are expected to hit $53 trillion by 2025. According to Bloomberg, and that represents around a third of global assets under management. So that's not too shabby. A third of global assets under management are going to be ESG. So that's a positive, absolutely. But within that, we have an issue in the sense that the ESG world, as it were, is fractured. That it leaves black holes for innocent mistakes and perhaps less innocent greenwashing, and the risk of that as well. And it's the level of accountability still, because we don't have the metrics metrics, because it's the analysis isn't as strong as it needs to be. The accountability to mega fossil firms and the petrodollars that go with that, and how they are helping the environment, and that's still a bit wishy-washy at the moment. What's your take on that? What would you like to see happen?
Wishy-washy, exactly. The word I would come to was fluff. Look, we've seen a fundamental reallocation of capital. It's been driven by unpriced climate risk. The market needs certainty. They work on numbers. And look, if you look at disclosures, you see a lot of sort of nice to have information rather than, hard
data.
And it's really hard. I mean, we reach out to our investors. We ask them, what do you want? And they say, look, we struggle to pick out the signal from the noise. And so we've made a real effort. I work with a colleague of mine, Johnny R, who heads up our investor relations team, and he's been great in really supporting what we're doing around really getting rigor around our data, burning off that fluff, telling our story to numbers. Okay, having a supporting narrative that puts some context, but everyone wants the backstory, but we need to, one of the things we got from our analysts was that we don't want to have to wade through a 50-page sustainability story to pull out the salient facts that will influence our allocation decisions. So give us the data. So that's what we've done, and I think my recommendation is to industries do that. I mean, we've got an ESG data sheet of all the core information they say they need. Excel spreadsheet, they download and they use it. We've done our TCFD climate disclosure. Again, that was an ask from them. So they get clarity on unpriced climate risk in our business. And finally, what we did was set up an investor microsite with all the ESG data. So it's a one-stop shop. And I think in answer to your question, as well as waving the petrofac flag, look, be rigorous with your data. Less is more. Focus on what's material, and reach out to your stakeholders as broadly as you can to understand what their needs for the data is, and then give them what they need.
Thank you, Greg, very much. I think that's a very strong point to end on, and I hope you come back and join us, because I'd like to go more into the enable, reduce, and transform, those three pillars that you mentioned at the beginning. We've covered so much, we weren't able to go into those in much detail, but I'm quite keen to hear the details of how those are going to be rolled out. So hopefully you'll come back and join us again. Thank you very much for your time, and look forward to speaking to you soon.
Absolutely, it's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.